Welcome to St. John's Cathedral, an Episcopal house of prayer for all in metropolitan Denver. I'm Broderick Greer, associate priest and host of Mile High Theology, a podcast exploring life's big questions of meaning, belonging, and justice. Nayira Waheed has said, "Poetry is evidence that the heart thinks and the mind feels." The heart thinks and the mind feels. Whether in his work as a socially minded poet or a poetic social worker, tonight's guest is evidence that binaries of feeling versus thinking or individuality versus justice simply don't work. He comes to this platform as a two-time Grand Slam champion, a National Poetry Slam finalist, an individual World Poetry Slam finalist, and a two-time TEDx speaker who has performed at hundreds of cultural events, social actions, detention centers, conferences, and colleges and universities across the United States and abroad. Please join me in welcoming, before that, two things actually. If you have not voted, please go vote. You can listen to this later. Second, for those who are guests and are not familiar with our space, through the doors to my right and your left, up the ramp, you will find restrooms, which is usually the first thing that people need and want when they come to the cathedral, besides God. So please join me in welcoming Bobby LeFebre, the state of Colorado's 8th Poet Laureate, to Mile High Theology.
How's everybody doing? Yeah. Raise your hand if you voted. Yeah, all right, we need that. Thank you so much for having me. I am blessed to be here in this beautiful space. I was telling Broderick, this just may be the most beautiful place I've ever read poems. And at this time in our nation's history, this time in our world's history, thank you. You could have heard it. The acoustics are wonderful either way. When I was doing sound check, I just wished I could sing because I just wanted to sing in this space, but I can't, and I wouldn't put you all through that. But as I was saying, sort of where we are right now as a nation, in our world right now, we need these convenings, right? We need poetry. We need to sit in a room together and talk about our existence and the things around us. I have an ambitious set list for the next 30 minutes. And this first poem touches a little bit about history and using the metaphor of coming to the table, right? We often use this metaphor when we're talking about being inclusive. And sometimes we forget how heavy that is. So this is about coming to the table. Come, all of you, and gather around the table. Bring with you the heavy luggage society has unfairly packed for you, the bags overflowing with barriers you have somehow ingeniously figured out how to navigate. Or if your bags are a bit less heavy or are filled to the brim with privilege passed down like an heirloom, bring them too. Do not fret if you feel your cup is empty or if your china is encrusted with gold, for today we'll treat this table as an equalizer. Today, honest conversation and selfless action will be the food that nourishes us. Before we sit, let us pass our stories around like bread. Take a piece for yourself, but always be conscientious. Ensure there is enough to go around, for some know there is not always enough to go around. Or maybe there's always been enough. Maybe in the back, in the rooms where the food is prepared, there is a surplus of things, tucked away from the grasp and eyes of the peering. Stockpiles of things, cannily sharing a wall with moaning scarcity. Maybe the meal was designed this way, where some are intentionally invited to the helping, others intentionally left off the guest list, no seat pulled out or given up, no place setting bearing their name. And as they say, if you are not invited to the table, it is possible that you are on the menu. And those without seats, those of us tired of being consumed, how this collection of your ugly we have been saving. Saving for moments just like these, boxes filled with old bones and new blood, attics packed with epithets and mason jars full of scars, cedar chests stacked with broken treaties, and the nooses tied around our forefathers' necks. We keep under our beds the sting of your water hoses and the no dogs or Mexicans you once flew proudly like flags. Buried in lockboxes beneath our fruit trees is the barbed wire of your internment camps, the bars of the prisons you built, salivating with us in mind. We have, next to the extra Virgin Mary candles in our closets, the gods ripped from our grandmothers, the languages you choked out of our throats. We have albums thick with snapshots of history our DNA refuses to forget. We store in file cabinets next to broken olive branches the names of family and friends deported, the names of family and friends banned, and you wonder why we grimace when we taste your apple pie, why the sweetness you savor is too bitter for us to swallow. You wonder why we kneel when your flag is raised, why our bald fists still have to punch holes in your pretty blue sky, because we know that what the machine hasn't already swallowed, it will most definitely be coming for. Tractors with growling bellies, with flesh between their teeth, this disease that runs rabid through them, this unquenchable thirst for things that are not theirs. Your tables are not new to us. These tables you made us fashion but refused us to sit at. Our hands and feet and hearts know them well. This perk of being the builder, this perk of baptizing the wood with your sweat. In your rearview mirror, you can see us coming, but we're not coming for your head necessarily. We're aiming for the humanity that is buried in the basement of your heart. Our very existence is ceremony, this struggle sewn into our being, this survival radiating from our resilience, this joy we make space for despite the sting. Do not be surprised if you ask why the invitation was late. If we show you we built a table of our own, one we fashioned out of necessity when we realized yours wasn't large enough to hold us. Don't be surprised if we hand you a wrecking ball before we do our voice, if we ask you to dismantle the comfortable place you sit at as we watch, and when you are finished, pass the wrecking ball to us. We too will break down the silos we have built. Then, when we are both left standing in the rubble of what used to be, let us weigh our pieces until the scale is balanced, for it is not enough to have a seat at the table. One must be the designer of it. So let us destroy to rebuild anew. Let us unpack our bags, lend each other our ears, and gift each other our hearts, for listening and loving are foundations to understanding, and conflict does not have to be combat. Conflict can be a supple garden that change grows in, so let's grow things together. Let us sit at a new inclusive table, pass our stories around like bread, eat, be fed, be healthy, be valued, and truly be heard. Thank you. I was in the San Luis Valley this weekend, and my family has roots in northern New Mexico and in the San Luis Valley. And I was talking to Broderick before coming out here, and I explained to him that I'm a cultural Catholic and recovering Catholic, right? I was raised in those spaces. But one thing I love to do when I'm in northern New Mexico or southern Colorado is visit all of the holy places. Anybody been to the Santuario in Chimayo in northern New Mexico? Beautiful space, right? I wrote this poem while there. The doors entering the Santuario at Chimayo are heavy and made of wood. Heavy and made of wood like a cross. A cross holding the crucified hangs upon the altar. The altar is intricately painted and is made of wood. Wood is also what the pews were carved from. In the pews, there is an elder clutching a crucifix, 59 beads rotating with purpose between pointer finger and thumb. The Lord's Prayer leaves his lip rhythmically in Spanish like a song. The echo of his baritone bounces across the thick, cold adobe. His eyes are sealed shut as if he is trying to see something, sealed shut as if he is trying to forget. Faith is a beautiful paradox. The way it professes certainty without proof, the way it suggests flight without wings. I watch the fearing genuflect and braid their hands into willful submission. I watch them root their ritual in elemental things, water, fire, dirt, all things you can see. Faith hangs from the hearts of men like a beautiful piece of art I admire from afar but can never get myself to buy. How beautiful it is to browse, appreciation dripping from my heart like the wax of the Holy Spirit burning upon the tabernacle. Yeah, that space is beautiful, and the dirt and the land, I always enjoy my time there. And this next poem sort of speaks to that as well. I was telling Broderick that my parents used to send me to the San Luis Valley in the summertime, in the 90s here in Denver when the streets were hot, when gang violence and things were kind of popping off on the streets. And now that I look back at it, that was a strategic move on their part to keep me away from those things. But in that, I was able to connect to culture in a way that I may not have if I didn't have that opportunity. So this poem is for those of us here in these lands who have always been here, who have migrated across these lands before borders, and especially for the people of the Southwest. I have ancestors buried in the San Luis Valley at Los Cerritos Cemetery, where the Rio and the red-winged blackbird and the crushing rock beneath the tires of our pickup truck is the only sound. Where the tall, swaying grass hums as its golden body moves in unison like a choreographed number beneath the vast and unending sky. I wipe away the dust that has gathered atop the black and white photo of my great-great-grandfather's tombstone. Something my dad swore he was going to chip out one day, but never has. Bored kids use them for target practice, he would say. But maybe it was only him who did that as he pranced through the eternity of the llano as a child. Manasa, the pueblito where my grandparents worked and fell in love, still has no stoplights and life moves slowly as the chile simmers on the stove. My great-uncle tells me stories of adobe and the acequias that once carried water like a sacrament to the land. Tells me his father herded sheep for the people who looked like us but had money. Tells me that we come from people with names like Cipriano, Liberato, Cleotilde, Maclovio, and Teodoro. He talks of the Spanish the same way the textbooks do, ignoring the tamales steaming in the kitchen and the braids his mother wore like survival down her back. He tells me that we come from people whose hands were not afraid of the earth, people who relied on prayer. How my grandfather, a penitente, would bind cacti to his back, whip himself with the disciplina, asking his God for pity. How does this not make sense when the mountains in the distance are named after the blood of Christ? I have watched the river in Los Brazos perform miracles Christ-like, feeding more men from its belly than one can imagine, there on the bank where we know much of bread and fish. The tecolote in the tree stares down at us like an elder who has seen yesterday and knows about tomorrow. Its calm and poise a testament to the lessons of the land. This land of conflict and culture, where people old as the sun once roamed freely, before swords and armor and land grants, where the wind had a voice and the ears listened. Mexico, Nuevo Mexico, and El Valle de San Luis are the same body. The migration back and forth before imaginary lines is ancient. So when they ask us where we are from, we need not say anything. We simply point to the soil and say, right here. Thank you. That's a loaded question, right? When people ask you where you're from, right? We get that a lot, us people of color, us who have been othered. And it's not a question rooted in genuine curiosity or wanting to getting to know us. It's a question of wondering how much value you're going to place on me when you ask us those questions. And we're at an interesting point in our nation's history where we seem to suffer from this collective amnesia around immigration, around where we come from, because we often forget that unless you're indigenous to these lands, you too came from somewhere. Your people came from somewhere. Our people came from somewhere. And so as a poet, I like to talk about those things. As a poet who has roots to this land, but also stands in solidarity with the people who are being othered, coming from other places right now. And sometimes, it's kind of fun to be a poet because you can write poems like this next one. This one's called Instructions for Those Who Fear Immigrants and Refugees. Start by climbing your family tree. Traverse the beautiful branches, passing your parents and familiar relatives until you arrive at your ancestors. Take a moment to recognize your eyes in theirs. Smile. Embrace them. Talk to them. Do not be alarmed that they speak a language different from yours. Teach your tongue, the linguistic amnesiac, their idiom. It used to be yours too. Share a traditional meal with them. Maybe one lost to assimilation in the melting pot. When they pass the bread, take notice of the calluses on their hands, the way their tattered clothing seems to drape from their bones. As your foremother clears the table and your forefather moves to sit in his favorite chair, ask them how it felt crossing an ocean to reach the land of opportunity. Now descend from your family tree, and in your best broken Spanish, ask the same questions to the earth-colored man who cooks at your favorite restaurant. Ask the woman who cleans toilets in your office building. Ask the child crying in a cage. Ask them how it felt being forced to leave home to reach the land of opportunity. Chances are their stories will sound exactly like the ones that are running through your veins. Last year, I don't know if you all saw the photo. There was a photo of a Salvadoran man and his daughter who had drowned in a river. Anybody see that photo? Very visceral photo that circulated online, and it really brought conversation out about what's happening along our borders, how people are dying to get here. And as someone, again, who has had citizen privilege for a long, long time, I feel like it's my duty as someone who's in front of people to ensure that those folks don't go unseen. To talk about our relatives that are literally dying to come here. And when I saw that photo, I wrote this poem for them. And I like to say their names because their names are representative of so many other people who have also perished during that journey. So this poem is for Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria. I imagine her 2-year-old heart was small. Maybe the size of an unripened fruit. Something green. Something growing toward promise. Something not quite ready to be consumed. I imagine his heart was big. Maybe the size of better tomorrows. Something peaceful. Something imaginary. Something that could not wait. I cannot tell you why the river was hungry. Why desperation continues to find itself stuck between the river's teeth. But dreams are boats that will not sink with bodies. Humanity a buoy that floats where breath succumbs. There, along the water's bank, belly down among the reeds, brown bodies expired like yesterday, like tomorrow. I am convinced this country likes it that way. There, it is easier to wash the blood dripping undeniably from its hands. So this is happening every day, right? And we see a photo or something that reminds us of it, and it also, in some ways, hopefully reminds us of our humanity and our connection to one another. And right now, I feel like love really is one of the only things that can bail us out of this situation that we're in. Anybody in love in the building? Yeah? 1.5 of you? Yeah? All right. Well, it's a beautiful thing, right? So I'm going to read a couple love poems, if that's fine. We have to find love in what we do, in who we are, and how we engage with the world around us. Without it, we become hollow, and we get away from that humanity that binds us. This work that I do as a poet really attempts to connect us across those bridges that we impose upon one another, those things that get in the way. But sometimes it's just good to be in love with someone. That's what these next ones are about. Of all the fragrant blossoms in the garden, it was your petals that beckoned me to pour my life upon your roots. I have watched you grow from flower to fire, drunk from your perfume and bathed in your flames. You have taught me that love is the unmolested shimmer of the sun in a cloudless sky. It is also the trickle of blood that rises to the surface when the skin is peeled back. On days like these, We foolishly take notice of the years we've revolved around one another. But universes are vast and immeasurable. Oceans are unending and too large to swallow whole. We, like them, are too infinite to recognize where we begin and where we end. A dozen roses for love. 1. I will not tell you I love you today, for love is too narrow a box to contain all that we are. Together, we are sky, vast and star-filled, a mix of precious things visible and uncharted. We are light and darkness, slow dancing upon the moon, our shadows, two hearts eternally entwined. 2. Your name is honey spilling from my lips. When I speak of you, the air around me sweetens. Your syllables are the breeze the bumblebees get drunk upon. My heart is a garden that grows things you've planted, my soil, an addict for your hands. 3. There are days when our love is veiled. Hours the rain falls so heavily it is impossible to see the sun. These are moments when words are clumsy and unnecessary. The fires we built inside one another survived the downpour. This is what it means to be inextinguishable, forever reciprocally woven into our bones. 4. It is not cliche for the poet to write poems on days like these. You know there are pages Bibles thick that bear your name. Sometimes these words are gifted to you on a Thursday, sometimes before bed or after breakfast, sometimes for no reason at all. 5. You have carved your initials into this wild heart of mine. Learn to swim in waters that would swallow others whole. Look how I harvest these songs for you. This gunny sack full of fruit I hoist upon my back. These blessings I leave like offerings at your altar. 6. At night, when the sun rests and the crickets choir, lay your head upon my chest. Braid your fingers into mine and paint your dreams upon my ears. Tell me what the world has tried to make of you, then sing your resistance song. I will memorize this manifesto and call you by your chosen name. 7. I am convinced that God lives inside the house of your laugh, this booming place of vitality that is contagious and pure. I do not pray often, but there are times you manifest the holy for me. I genuflect on these days like a sinner in a confessional. Give me my penance and I shall serve. 8. True love exists in the quiescence of the valley, in the spaces between the peaks. I have kissed you atop the pyramids, held your hand while prancing upon the clouds, slice open the simple and watch everything spill. 9. I see the way the moon looks at you at midnight, the way the silver weaves itself into your hair. Incandescence casts a devilish smile in your direction, stardust lingering like blush across your cheeks. When you tell the celestial you are mine, the sky abandons us both. 8, 10. In the distance, the world is collapsing in on itself. Faith is a lost soul holding a gun to its head. The suffering outside is booming and wretched, but you and I are an island of chaotic peace. Our love, a refuge we escape to, if only in our own minds. 11. We are but falling stars across the cosmos, flickers of life that slowly plummet to the grave. I will leave this world having felt the fire of another, given my blood and bones unselfishly. This is the purest sacrifice and reward that has ever been. 12. I will not give you flowers today. I will not take the life away from something living to elicit a smile from you. Instead, I cut these roses from my being, some pretty, others withered, all with thorns. This vase I place into your hands is filled with water and life. This gift of petals I throw at your feet. Yeah. So sometimes when you love someone and you're contemplating life, sometimes you have to talk about the opposite of that too, right? And talk about death. And one night, my partner at the time literally just asked me, "Yo, when you die, what do you want me to do with you?" I was like, "What? Huh?" And I didn't have the answer to that question in real time, right? I was like, "I don't know. I'm not really planning on going anywhere anytime soon. I haven't really thought about it." But as all good poets do, we use everything for inspiration. So that night, I wrote this. It's called "What to Do with Me." When this body becomes too weary to carry the life inside of it, take the lumber of my remains and build a shrine. Of my bones, construct the altar. Unearth the heirlooms buried underneath my tongue and melt them into glass cylinders. From my memories, braid a wick and light it. Mix my blood with earth, sand, and sticks. Mold me into adobe bricks and let me harden in the sun. Make walls of me. Use the tattoos from my flesh to decorate the stucco. Of my veins, weave a walkway that leads to a garden. Scatter my dust where the roses grow. Sit with me in times of blooming, but pluck me like fruit when it is time. Take my teeth and place them inside a hollowed-out gourd. When you miss my voice, shake the rattle and dance to my song. Use clay to make a mold of my lips. Fashion it into a cup you can kiss when you thirst for me. When you are left with nothing but my organs, wrap them inside my favorite shirt and bury me beneath a tree. As for my heart, that has always belonged to you. Do with it as you wish. Yeah. I had to remind her, though, that that was a poem, right? Because if she actually did those things, I'm pretty sure she'd be arrested, right? Can't have that happen. And sometimes you have love, and sometimes love is elusive, and sometimes it leaves you, right? Anybody ever lost love, felt loss? That could be a person, that could be a project, that could be a feeling, that could be all kinds of things. Love comes in many different forms. And this next poem is about that. It's about a love that is here one day and gone the next. This is called Wind Chaser. There is a madman on the loose who insists on chasing the wind. He runs from one end of the earth to the other, eyes wide open, moving in the same direction as dancing leaves and the pollen escaping the clutch of the cottonwoods. This invisible kiss that bends the necks of tulips and men. This kiss that coaxes the song out of hollow chimes. He hunts this magic anxiously, like a wolf who's never tasted the blood of its prey. This quest for something fleeting, something infeasible of being static or immured for too long. But the madman chases the wind, gallops and dashes in every direction. The grass sways and the tumbleweeds roll. When he tires, he rests his weary head upon the thorns of the battleground, allows the elusive breeze to cool his sweat-beaded brow, allows the breeze to caress his wounds and lips by moving in, through, and around him. These unseen fingers caressing the softest and most callous parts of him. This lover of transience that always knots his mind. When the man is still, his repose is not peaceful, for the swirling wind soon abandons him as he rests. There is a madman chasing the wind, its path as curious and uncertain as a fluttering butterfly's, this ephemeral altar he prays to. There are things in this world built to belong to nothing or no one. Forces so wild the earth often feels like a cage. Existences that feed off of freedom and open roads, but there is a man who chases the wind. His legs have become weathered boats with broken sails. He paddles to the shore to enter the house he built for two. The house is cold. It has no windows, and the candle on the table burns low. The wind pours herself into the space, visiting the man briefly. As she extinguishes the candle in passing, like always, he knows that she is there, that she has always been, and that in some ways she will always be. But this time, he accepts that she cannot stay, for the wind is a wanderer whose only home is wherever she happens to be. He walks her to the door, kisses her goodbye for the last time, and tomorrow, he will not run. Thank you. So, talking about voting again and where we're at, right? There's this idea of justice that I think that we have, or at least maybe I have. I'm going to speak with I statements. I have this idea of justice that is just that, right? Is just, and that it works for everyone. And those of us who do social justice work, we do this work tirelessly, hoping that we see things change. And sometimes change is longitudinal, and sometimes it's not fast. And I think that the things that we do on a daily basis, the choices that we make, the way that we choose to engage with the world, either puts us one step closer to that ideal or one step behind. So this poem is about justice. There are sweet bells of justice ringing righteously in the distance. From where we stand, the sound is faint but unmistakably beautiful. From where we stand, faith convinces us to listen to what we hunger to one day see. These recondite sounds, majestic as the quetzal's coo. These recondite sounds, soothing as the lullaby the Colorado sunset sings as it slow dances across the horizon, and we run with hope and abandon in the direction of the chimes. Traverse an American landscape that has made winners of some and bullseyes of others. Traverse an American landscape that has been stolen, enslaved, and interred with bones and blood. Even still, we run feverishly toward the bells because on good days, we know the ideals that live where the music is promise equality, promise prosperity, promise liberty and justice for all. Our hearts are compasses that point in the direction of freedom. Our hands, shovels unafraid to dig into the dirt. Our voices, keys we use to open doors not meant for us to walk through. Our minds, luscious playgrounds where dreams and better tomorrows marry in the chapel of perseverance. For in the distance, maybe just outside our reach, balanced scales beseech to be seen. In the distance, the sword Lady Justice wields in her right hand is not slashing disproportionately. In the distance, her blindfold has not yet slipped from her eyes. Beneficence is the red road we have traveled, dignified the path we have carved with promise. We are the fruit our ancestral roots dreamed into existence, flowers cultivated in the garden of hard work and sweat. Courageous is the one who speaks the truth boldly, even if butterflies pinball inside their belly, the one who swims against an ominous current when the waves are unjust. Over a lifetime, the human heart beats more than 2 billion times without stopping. This means that we have 2 billion reasons to stretch our wings, to fly in the face of adversity, to dance amid the smoke, to love through all the hate. May boundaries be nothing more than invitations for exploration, a starting line from which we sprint in the direction of the uncharted, a catapult that launches us in the direction of the fruition of our dreams. May justice prevail. May be not a fleeting illusion only pursued, but a beacon of virtue we attain tirelessly and justly together. For in the distance, the bells are still ringing, promise is calling, and we will not stop running until we all arrive, until we all are free. Thank you. I've got one more. So this thing, right? Art and culture, right? Poetry. It's an ancient thing. And us as artists, we work really, really hard to convey these messages, to connect with people in ways that are genuine. And so I want to thank you all for coming out here to listen to poetry, to be here and engage in conversation. This poem attempts to personify the way that I feel art and culture is a tool that we can use to connect with one another. It's called an exercise in ritual. We gather here together in this sacred circle like we always have. Here around this fire that has always burned. The same fire that lives in our bellies and makes an inferno of our hearts. This spirit we summon. This beauty we conjure, this inventiveness we invoke. What is a vessel but a carrier of the coveted, a transmitter of quintessence, a conduit of culture? Come and meet us at the place where ritual is given a body, where ceremony is given a face, where our existence transfigures into a song we warble in unison. For he who sharpens his imagination is a visionary. She who gives shape to intuition is a prophet. They who hone mortality beseech the immortal. Look at what we are building together. We, the masons of reimagining, the architects of metamorphosis, the repositories of our collective consciousness. Blessed be the makers, the ones who set themselves ablaze willingly to warm the masses, the ones who traverse the unknown, giving life to the unseen. Join us as we turn ourselves inside out. Watch as we illuminate what kindles inside our bones, these places where we find and lose ourselves at the same time. These places we devise with purpose, these aesthetics we mold from the supple clay of our minds. Join us at these holy places of abandon, these playgrounds of ingeniousness, these geneses of more inspired tomorrows. For who does not admire a flower unfolding? Who does not feel the warmth of the sun shining boldly upon their face? Whose feet do not move at the coaxing of the drum's sound? Here, where we live, boundaries and the impossible do not have a name. Here, fear and failure suffocate under the weight of creation. Here, convention is an earth-covered tombstone rotting in the wind. Blessed be the creatives, the ones predisposed to questioning, the ones with an immoderate hunger for understanding. Come and meet us at a new juncture where expression devoid of consciousness is merely decoration, where art is an insistent incubator for justice, where equity and access are an altar we decorate with the flowers of promise and purpose. For what is it to highlight the margins but to attempt to balance the scales? What is a raised fist but a war cry in the language of the purposely silenced? What is dissent but an innate aversion to the confines of the status quo? Art and culture is a communal land that does not know borders, a common language we are all born speaking fluently, a right that has been paraded around as a privilege for far too long. Come and help us rip the esoteric from the sky. Let our hands reach for the stars, grasp them, and share their tangible glow with anyone drawn to their light. And here, we will all shine and wander together. Here, we will eradicate all of the man-made barriers we impose upon one another. This beautiful burden we carry, this responsibility tethered to our pens, paint, pirouettes, percussion, and performance. This work, this digging, these hands unearthing the truth, this joy, this beauty, this struggle, these songs, these testaments, these heirlooms, these markers of humanity that remind us that we are here, that we are alive, that we always have been, and that we always will be. Thank you.
I feel like this is probably, we're not a snapping crowd, but I feel like that would be the...
Yeah, I mean,
I don't
whatever
know.
moves you.
We're church people, so we're not that cool.
Oh, okay. Well, let's start. Let's
At
make
least
you cool.
I'm not. So, Bobby, I mean, you've said so much. That from the get-go was so incredibly meaningful. And we're just grateful for that. We're so grateful you're here with us this evening, and we're just curious about what a day in your life looks like.
Yeah. Every day's different. However, so in addition to Poet Laureate duties, I work in social work. So my day career, my day work is managing a team of social workers who work with young people. So I work with, we work with youth 12 to 18 in the city of Denver who are in legal trouble, have been abused and neglected. And I also manage a state program that's administered by a federal program called the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program. So we resettle refugee youth from all over the world who are fleeing situations in their home countries that render them refugees. So that's my day work. And then I've always been a performer and an actor. So I also do a lot of acting work. So I do on-camera work. And this Poet Laureate thing has been really interesting in that in the few months that I've held the position, we've had an unprecedented amount of requests for me to come and do things. I was in the San Luis Valley this weekend at a poetry festival. I do, readings and workshops and facilitate conversation and, talk about art and culture. I do a lot of art and culture administrative work, so I'm on boards and commissions. So I sit on the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs, which is the city's art and culture board. I'm on the board for the Clifford Still Museum, the Latino Cultural Arts Center, on and on and on. So my life really revolves around people, conversation, and art.
Amazing. What led you into poetry?
So, for me, the foundational, I guess, lead into poetry for me, I would say, are two things. One, hip hop culture. I was raised in hip hop culture. And so rap music was my first real introduction to figurative language. So listening to hip hop, I was connecting with messages through metaphor and simile that, these performers were using. And I didn't know until later what they were doing, but that was sort of one entry point. The other entry point was as a performer. I actually started, before I started doing poetry, I was an actor. So I've been an actor since I was maybe 13 years old. And I was doing some summer workshops that led me to an open mic poetry reading. And for the first time, I went to a space in 5 Points called Cafe Nuba. It's hot and it's black, for anybody that doesn't know. Which was a poetry venue run by Ashar Ekundayo, who was a cultural worker here in Denver, who ran the Pan-African Arts Society. And back when 5 Points was a predominantly black neighborhood, not so much anymore. That history is being erased by what's happening in our city everywhere. But she curated this amazing monthly poetry reading. And at that time, it was mostly black and brown poets coming and sharing poetry. And for the first time, I saw this thing that was a marriage of dramatic monologue, hip-hop, first-person narrative, all kind of, blended into one. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but I want to do that thing. So I started to write for these spoken word events, these open mics, and it was probably very bad at the beginning. I think it was terrible. But I started to get better and really started to study who was doing what. Found poets like Saul Williams that were at the time really doing performance poetry on a national level, visible in film and all these other ways. And then that sort of evolved. When I was in college, I started to read literature seriously for the first time. Not only literature, but literature written by people of color whose stories I saw myself in. So we were reading, in our intro to Latino literature class, all of the greats. We were reading Neruda and Sandra Cisneros, these writers that were telling stories about people like us. And that led me to further, read poetry. And then it just never stopped. And I just kept growing and doing different things that involved poetry. And now I'm doing all this wonderful work.
So along those lines, we talked about this a little bit before tonight's program. I heard a black poet say once that poets of color can often get pigeonholed into what's called spoken word. And this poet, their response to that was, spoken word is just another way of saying your poetry is really good. You're really good at performing poetry. Can you talk a little bit about that moniker and its baggage in our culture?
Yeah. So, like anything, arts and culture and the literary world, in the world of poetry, does not live outside the house of racism and white supremacy and things that are foundational elements to the way that we run our institutions and how things have come to be. And so usually what they're referring to is that what they're doing lives outside of the canon of what people are comfortable with, a canon that is steeped with the dead old white guys, right, who are great to understand and learn in all those things. But what happens is, in literature as in other places, anything that doesn't fit into that canon or is outside of that is othered. And we do this really well to poets of color where we say, oh, you do that cute performative spoken word thing, right? And the connotation is that's street, that's urban, that's this, and it lives outside of the canon, outside of this idea of what we have relegated poetry to. And so it's funny because when I do stuff and I don't give them a bio or whatever, they introduce me a lot of times as a spoken word artist, and I've never written that in any of my bios, but they associate what we do in this way to that. And there's a really weird rift between page and stage poets. Page poets being more in line with the literary traditions that we're, taught are all of our traditions, and the stage poets who are considered more folk artists, But yeah, there is baggage there, and I'm all of it. I am a spoken word artist because I think that these things, poetry's always lived out loud, right? It's only recently that we've relegated that to books, and the oral tradition and the oral history of poetry far will outlive the literary stuff.
Yeah, I know in preaching, one would never say that a text of a sermon is a sermon. Like the sermon is kind of the living moment, the words, and the gathered community, and that is what makes it a homily or a sermon. And it sounds to me that
Exactly the same.
that can be translated to poetry as well.
Absolutely, it's the same thing.
Fascinating. One thing that you say in an exercise and ritual, which is one of my favorite poems of yours, is this: look at what we are building together, we the masons of reimagining, the architects of metamorphosis, the repositories of our collective consciousness. What do you see as the role of poetry in public life? And why should poetry be a public good and not just something people do or write in private?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a poet, we're so much more than just. I don't think the act of writing poetry is a very solitary process. We're alone, we're creating alone, but we're always creating with the hope that someone else is going to see that and that it's going to resonate with someone. And so I think good poets are not isolated. I think good poets are cultural translators. Poets are folks that are able to take in, distill, and then, give something. And I think ultimately that's the gift of all art, and poetry in particular, is that all poetry really is, when I talk to young people, all poetry is an observational art form. And all we're doing is we're making connection between things that seemingly may not have a connection. We're looking at the world around us, and we're connecting it with thoughts and feelings and ideas and words. But the minute that something becomes that isolated, it loses its heart and its effect. So when I received the Poet Laureate position, I talked a lot about that. With the governor, about my idea of what poetry is, and that it should be something that is widespread, and that we should be able to connect with people in all places, in rural communities, and in places that may not have access to it, so that they can see the everyday applicability of it in their own lives, and that we broaden the definition of what constitutes poetry, because we experience it every single day. We're in our cars and we're listening to our favorite songs, or we're listening to the wisdom of our grandmothers through sayings, or in Spanish we have these dichos that they're like little rhyming couplets that have a message. There's poetry in so much of the daily things that we do. And sometimes poetry is more than just writing something or creating something on page, or even talking about it. Poetry can be literally the way that we live our lives, the way that we see the world around us, and the way that we make connection to those things in a very human way.
I'm Broderick Greer, and I'm here with Colorado's 8th Poet Laureate, Bobby LeFebre. I think we do have time for one or two questions. So Evans has a mic if anyone has a question for Bobby. There's one there.
So if you were to try to define poetry, how would you try to do that?
To define poetry. I would probably begin by, I think that the definition of poetry is kind of what I was talking about earlier. It's the, if somebody asked me what's your definition of it, I would say that for me it's a tool to come in contact with and share our humanity. Because what we do when we're writing poetry is we're giving life to oftentimes things intangible, right? So we're feeling something. Again, for me, it's a very observational art form. So I find connections in things all the time. I have to control myself sometimes because there's so much beauty in the world, there's so much hurt in the world, there's so much going on around us, and if we tune into those things, the poet can become overwhelmed. And I think that the poet doesn't have to be, someone who creates poetry. I think poetry can literally be the lens by which we view the world. And so I would say it's about connection and shared existence.
Amazing. And we have time for two more, I think.
I marvel at your life and all the things you're able to fit into it. So I'm just curious, how do you structure your days in terms of prioritization and organizing them? I know we already heard some of it, but also how does your practice of art fit into that? How do you make the time to create art as well?
Yeah, I have this very strange, I've been an artist a long time, and I've worked with artists a long time, and I've seen the spectrum of how we live. And so you have the artists that are completely 100% artists, and they don't, and this sounds like a cliche, but it's really not. There are people who are genuinely just concerned with creating, and they have no sense of time, space, other people, and I am not that person. I have this very strange right-left brain marriage that allows me to be completely wild on one side and overly organized on the other. And so I live this really strange life. Lately, I haven't been sleeping a lot. I've been sleeping enough, but there's just so much to do, and there's so much that creating has been hard, especially when I've been so busy going around sharing and being in community. It's really hard to set time to write, but I know that writers freak out all the time when they're not producing, and they think that there's this thing that exists called writer's block. But if you're a poet, you're going to be a poet. I'm going to be a poet regardless if I don't write another poem in the next 30 years. Again, for me, poetry is about the way that I live my life. It's about the way I see things. And it happens when it happens. And I have the luxury, and I think it is a luxury and a privilege to not have to have poetry be my only way that I make a living, because I think that would ruin it for me, because then I would feel pressure to do more and to create more. But the way that I've set my life up, which is on purpose, is I have these multiple ways to engage with my different professional identities that give me the ability to have that balance. But it does get difficult when demand is there, but it's also a beautiful burden to have people. It's what bigger privilege is it than to have someone say they want you to come and say things to them, that what you say matters, to have someone to listen to you. It's an enormous honor and gift, and I try to do my best to get to as many people as I can, especially in this position, because I really believe in it. And because we live in a capitalist society, we have to also figure out what that means financially. And so I love to take money from people who have it and use it to do things for people who don't.
Amazing. We have time for one more question. I think this woman here to my right had her hand up.
Thanks. I'm just curious if you write any poetry only in Spanish, and if so, what that experience is like, and if it's different from writing in English.
I've never written a poem completely in Spanish on first draft because I don't speak Spanish fluently. My family comes from the generations of people who were forced assimilated through, cultural things and schools and institutions telling us that that wasn't okay. And so we lost language. My grandparents' generation was the last generation to speak Spanish in the home on a regular basis. My parents speak broken Spanish and understand everything, but only spoke Spanish when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about, when they're trying to keep stuff from us, right? And so what I have done, because I've done work in Mexico, I've done work in Cuba, I've done work in Spanish-speaking countries that it's polite to go to a place like that and do work in Spanish. So I've written bilingually, or I've written completely in English and then worked with friends of mine who are better in Spanish than I to translate, and then performed or read in Spanish in those places. But I also talk about that experience as a Latino in the United States who has lost language, because these umbrella terms that we use here to describe ourselves don't exist in those countries, and they're very interested in the ways that we parcel ourselves out and how identity politics in this country work. So it's a challenge of mine, though. I have tried, and I've written some short things completely in Spanish, and usually the people in my life that speak Spanish, they're like, yeah, almost. But it's an interesting cultural dynamic, and at first there's shame in that, and then you realize where it came from, and once you get past the idea that, the way that things are here sort of made you a victim to those things, you take less, there's less shame in that and more understanding, which then allows you to reverse that narrative and talk about it in a way that is meaningful. I actually have a poem called Verb Tense Confusion, and it's about my Spanglish. Yeah.
Amazing. Let's give Bobby a hand. And just one piece of housekeeping, Bobby will stick around to say hi to everyone who comes just right out of this door to my right and to your left. We call it Memorial Hall. There's coffee and water there, so please join us for a meet and greet with Bobby. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you all.
tonight.
Thanks for coming.
Perfect. The longest book of the Bible is a poetry collection we call the Psalms. In it, various people voice before God a longing for home and love, frustration, a desire for revenge, and anticipation of a future in which wisdom and peace reign. The 150 Psalms gives its readers a unique range of human emotion, a poem for almost every feeling, if you will. And that's what good poetry does. It stretches us, confirms that we are not alone, that someone has felt that feeling, yes, that feeling, before. That life is too short to compartmentalize complexity and suppress suffering. Which is why Bobby and the work of public poetry are so important to our common flourishing. The distilling of civic occasions, state and national moods, and the undertones of individual human experience is a gift to us all. It makes us better, more whole, more human. Mile High Theology is a production of St. John's Cathedral, an Episcopal community in Denver that is welcoming and inclusive of all. I offer special thanks to our guest, Bobby LeFebre, our audio engineer and cathedral communications coordinator, Evans Owsley, our cathedral administrator, Georgie Brooks Myrtle, our theme music composer, Noah Glenn, Jeffrey Riley, our videographer, Dustin Moon, our photographer, and you, our loyal listeners. Join us in May when Pastor Ann Scalfaro of Calvary Baptist Church discusses Christian imagination and the joy of Easter. Please review and rate Mile High Theology on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you again for joining us tonight.